Probably like a not insignificant amount of people, I first experienced the narrative of Spice and Wolf through its anime adaptation. I was only, 18 at the time, and did not have a lot of money to spend on light novels. Though even if I did, they didn't arrive in North America until much later. I watched fan-subbed versions of this interesting fantasy series where the subtitlers decided to name the main character Horo, based on the pronunciation of her name, and it kind of set the stage for what I would go on to enjoy about more traditional fantasy narratives from anime. At least the more calm and chill ones, anyway. There were still more action and adventure fantasies that I could and did watch, like Slayers and Lodos, but Spice and Wolf was a series that did not market itself on any grand stakes. We didn't experience this narrative from the perspective of a knight, a king, or even a lord, but rather a humble merchant. Sure, this humble merchant comes into contact with a fantastical being that some have referred to as a god. But even she does not fit within many established tropes someone of her stature would traditionally have had. She's lived for hundreds of years, watched countless generations of humans pass her by, but she is not something like a wise and reserved sage, even if she is called the Wise Wolf, and does act accordingly at her choosing. But more often she is impulsive, rash, quick to anger, and even quicker to fill with jealousy. If she truly is a god, then she is far more like the Greek interpretation of one, where her imperfections make up what she is, and why she is so fascinating to watch. While anime watchers have had little to go on since 2009, when the original adaptation ended, we just this year, in 2023, finally have an announcement of a remake, a new season, a new adaptation that is on the horizon to once again witness the wolf god of wheat and her merchant of coin travel together on an adventure. And I thought to myself, well, it's been a while since I've experienced this story. Why not go back and reflect on it some more in advance of this new adaptation? So today, I wanted to take a look back at Spice and Wolf, a series that has stuck in my mind as one of the better fantasy narratives to be adapted into an anime. Because as always, despite how long it's been, I feel like this is still a series that is worth experiencing and discussing. Welcome to Glance Reflections, Spice and Wolf Retrospective. Let's jam. Spice and Wolf, before it spawned off into many adaptations, spin-offs, and even VR games, was a light novel by Isuna Hasekura. He introduced it to the world in 2005 when he won the Dengeki Silver Novel Prize for the first volume of the novel, and then he released it to the public the following year under the Dengeki Bunko imprint. Some people might see that as a huge accomplishment and reward. However, I believe that Spice and Wolf did well in spite of that prize, and not because of it. This is because that same silver prize was given to lolly girls playing basketball in 2009, and then Whiplash given to Devil as a Part-Timer in 2010. So you can decide yourself how valuable and influential that particular award is. Say nothing of the gold and grand prize categories. Since its release, the series had 17 volumes published by 2011. However, despite calling volume 17 the epilogue, Hasekura decided to continue writing even more volumes for the main story. And as of the writing of this video, the series has 24 volumes of the light novel in print. The narrative got a manga adaptation in 2008 that spawned 16 of its own volumes, and that ended in 2018, ending despite the light novel having restarted by that point. And of course, in the late 2000s, Spice and Wolf had 2 anime seasons. It was an anime series so popular that it actually changed animation studios halfway through. That's something that's a little more common nowadays, but was far more of a rarity at the time, barring remakes. So let's talk about that. The anime adaptation of Spice and Wolf started airing in January of 2008. Looking back, it still surprises me how good it was, considering the staff had very few credits to their name. The first episodes were made over at Image Inn, and when considering the studio's entire catalog, not just what came out before Spice and Wolf, there are only a few shows that they produced solo. They have worked with other studios on various shows such as Chaos Head, Princess Resurrection, Strawberry Panic, and Technolize? Man, I didn't expect to mention that series in this video. But the studio's track record consists of only one major notable hit, and that is Spice and Wolf. Before Spice and Wolf, they only had a few projects, and one man directed most of them. Takahashi Takeo, who would be Spice and Wolf's only director, even with the series jumping between 2 studios. Actually, 3 studios if we include Passione and the upcoming readaptation. Because guess what? Takahashi's directing that one too. Takahashi directed 3 projects before Spice and Wolf. The first project was The Cosmopolitan Prayers from 2004. It was a magic adventure series about girls defeating monsters and restoring peace to the world. Also with fan service. He directed a 2004 ecchi comedy called Hit o Nerae, a series about a producer that lands a deal to make a series called Super Transforming Cosplayers. Also, for some reason this series includes nudity and panty shots. A lot of panty shots. Finally, the man directed Love, Love, the sequel to Hit o Nerae, and the narrative changes from a young female professional to a male writer. Said writer also ends up with a pseudo-harem. Oh, and this one also includes its own versions of nudity, to the surprise of no one. Oh, and that came out in 2004 as well. Yes, these 3 shows all came out in the same year. Heck, they were all released in the same 6 months. Cosmopolitan Prayers started on January 16th in the winter season for that year, with Love Love ending on June 28 after only 9 episodes, though that would go on to continue to have like 4 more OVA episodes, but even then everything was done before the end of the year. These were Takahashi's only credits as a director up till this point. 3 shows with little traction. One of these shows is so obscure, it doesn't even have its own Wikipedia page, if you care about that as a metric. Or, if we consider the long-standing user base of My Anime List, only like 7,000 people openly admit to having watched Hit o Nerae. This was the man that was set to direct the Spice and Wolf animated adaptation. And with just that information, it's hard to see why. It makes more sense in the context of the company that he worked most closely with. Imagine somehow got the rights to a light novel series starring a naked wolf girl, and they needed someone to direct the thing. So since Takahashi was in the leadership role for like 3 out of 5 shows that Imogen produced up to that point, he got the job. The fact that he also understood the market's desire and lust for fan service and otherwise unrelated narratives was a bonus, I think. Though Spice and Wolf was far from being the worst offender in Takahashi's portfolio, as in 2013 he would go on to direct an adaptation of Demon King and Hero, another series that focuses on economic challenges of a medieval society, but which also turned fan service as the real plot for a narrative about economics into a meme. Takahashi and Imogen helmed the Spice and Wolf adaptation for 12 episodes, making up the show's first season. Less than a year later, production moved from Imogen to Studio Brainsbase, though Takahashi continued as the show's director. The reason for the swap is not clear. Most of these deals are done behind closed doors, and as long as things don't go wrong, leading the adaptation to suffer, the general public doesn't care enough to dig into it. In general, studios themselves do not choose what anime adaptations to work on. They may choose not to work on something, but normally they are contracted by the original publisher to work on an adaptation. If the publisher wants to change things up, that's their prerogative. Executives at Dengeki Bunko, Spice and Wolf's publisher, could have been unsatisfied with the production. More than likely, though, considering that Takahashi was kept on as a director, the publisher probably wanted to move forward with a second season and, OVAs much faster than either Image-In could handle or would be willing to shoulder. So a new animation house was brought on to helm season 2. This is somewhat corroborated by Image-In remaining on the show's production committee, the same committee that Brainsbase didn't even hold a seat on. One could look at the studio dealings about the adaptation as purely business, a transaction between parties for financial gain with added steps that most adaptations never dealt with prior to this. And that would be fitting, for a series about a merchant who would try to do just that. So I think it's time to get into the narrative of Spice and Wolf itself. As this is a visual retrospective, we will be limiting talks about the narrative to only what was covered in the 2 anime seasons. There will be a couple of exceptions, and I'll get to those. But in general, this is because so many volumes of the light novel exist beyond what the anime covers, and I don't think anyone would enjoy me rambling for even more hours without footage to cut to. I will, of course, be doing my best to cover the differences between adaptations, even bringing in the manga where appropriate. Though with luck, I won't mix anything up. Because, when you have, the same story told 3 different ways, slightly differently each time, all the differences may get lost in my brain. But let us begin. The world in which Spice and Wolf exists is a medieval one, though not one that we become involved with in a large sense. As mentioned before, this is not a story about countries or alliances, at least not at the start. The story only mentions lords and bigger players to confirm their existence. Spice and Wolf, though, likes to stay focused instead on the small scale. Lawrence, a traveling merchant, thought he knew this world well, yet a chance meeting in a small farming village changed everything for him. The village itself has spent a long time worshipping a wolf god of wheat, Holo. They offer her praise and adoration, and over the generations, she has cared for their fields and made their harvests strong when she could. However, new farming techniques have been introduced, and because of this, the villagers have lost faith in Holo and become hostile towards her. They call her fickle, as not every season boasts good harvests. The townsfolk no longer talk to her, no longer respect her, and they don't understand her actions. So Holo decides she wants to leave. But as a spirit of the wheat, she cannot up and leave. She lives in the wheat, and must always live in the wheat. So it's to her great surprise that, at the very moment the villagers harvest the final bit of wheat from the fields, a nearby merchant happens to have a large bundle of it in his cart for her to escape into. It's not until the evening that Lawrence himself discovers his stowaway. Their meeting is an interesting one. Holo, a self-proclaimed wise and proud wolf, does not beg the merchant for travel. She doesn't plead to hitch a ride to her destination, but she uses her wit and cunning to charm the merchant and accept her existence. Lawrence himself is more shocked than anything. A young naked girl appears in his cart, claiming to be the pagan god of a nearby village, and she wants to leave to the north to find her home. Man, if only Lawrence spent a good chunk of the past day talking to his horse about how great it would be to have a companion on his travels. Oh wait, so this is quite fortuitous for him. After he recovers from the shock, the merchant informs Holo that, yes, they can travel together, but she must pay her own way. To which she agrees. This first arc is one that is unfortunately different in my head, because there is an anime-only version of it. The light novel is ever so slightly different from this point onwards. If you've only watched the show, let me explain the differences in the original light novel, and even the manga adaptation. In the anime, like in other media, Lawrence arrives alone in the town of Pazlaw. This is the town whose harvests Holo has been tending to for years, and when he arrives, he plans to chat with a fellow merchant. However, he leaves early because the merchant was chosen as the Holo for their yearly festival and gets confined to a storehouse. On the surface, no change yet. However, in both the original and the manga, said merchant from Pazlaw was a man by the name of Yare, who we actually know little about because he only shows up like 1 or 2 times. But in the anime, Yare is completely replaced by a female merchant named Chloe. Chloe, unlike Yare, escapes from the storehouse that night to visit Lawrence. Not only that, but their relationship is not simply a fellow merchants who meet up whenever they are in town together. Chloe was Lawrence's student. When? No idea. That's up to interpretation. But she appears before Lawrence and wants a more substantial business relationship with him. Perhaps a more physical relationship as well. This is all after he has met Holo, by the way. In the original, he enters Pazlaw, Holo slips into his wagon, and then he leaves to sleep on the road to the next town. He doesn't meet Yade. They explain this because as part of the town's festival, outsiders are driven out. Yet for some reason in the anime, he goes back into town that night after meeting Holo to sleep in a barn. He was already on the road. Why did he go back? Oh, right, so that Chloe can show up and make her proposals, I guess. Which Lawrence turns down by leaving with Holo the following day. It's an odd change that I can only explain as the anime attempting to throw a wrench into Holo and Lawrence's upcoming relationship. You know, even earlier than it already does in other versions. Chloe is portrayed as an alternative romantic option for Lawrence. Honestly, upon revisiting this part of the story after reading the light novel, I do find it strange that Lawrence made the choice that he did. Throughout the series, we discover Lawrence's dream of owning a shop, to stop being a traveling merchant, to settle down in one town and find a wife. That very dream is in some ways like offered to him in this adaptation's intro. Sure, it was after Holo's introduction, but like what Holo showed him was so magical and out of this world, one could forgive him for thinking that it was all just a dream. Lawrence's choice in the anime only makes sense if you either include information that the audience doesn't know, or by following one of our new favorite phrases here at Glass Reflection, the show must go on. Lawrence may have rejected Chloe's advances because of their mysterious past. Lawrence was a traveling merchant his whole professional life, though he trained her when they never explained when or how. Was it just a few conversations about work when he was stopped in town for a few days? Did Chloe travel with him for a time? Their relationship before the series is hinted at, but largely completely ignored. This is probably because, as an anime-only character, it would have been a distraction, as her true intention was just to be a rival to Holo. An unnecessary add-on, in my opinion. In the future, other characters would create challenges for their relationship. There was no need to present this additional romance option here, though perhaps her real purpose was to intensify the conflict at the climax of this arc. So Lawrence and Holo leave Pazlaw, heading north together. They are traveling to Holo's homeland along Lawrence's existing trade route, as he is yet undecided in how far he will go with her. I mean, in their introduction, she transforms her arm into a giant wolf's paw. Once he has recovered, she then takes his best clothes and constantly asks him for food. He's had his whole world turned upside down with the realization that gods of a sort actually exist. Not only that, he finds himself opening his purse strings even further when he learns that wolf gods love apples. With the introduction of our characters out of the way, it's time to discuss the narrative in earnest. Coming from someone who has watched and read everything, the problem now is how we want to divide the narrative, as this depends on the version or adaptation you are talking about. There are differences between all of them. They may adapt some things and skip other things. So, as I said before, for the sake of this video, we're going to stick with the anime adaptation in large part. I'll just add a bit in the middle that the anime skips over. So, the anime has 2 seasons that cover 4 major story arcs. In season 1, we have the silver scheme, and then sheep smuggling, and then in season 2, we cover the love of a merchant and the fur trade. Each of these 4 parts combined happens to focus on one particular aspect of the narrative that I personally didn't feel like it existed in other versions, at least not to the same extent. But we'll see if you notice what that is before I point it out later. The first arc has already begun with the narrative's introduction. If Chloe didn't exist past this point, there might have been a clean break, but she pops up later, so away we go. The real meat of this arc begins when our duo protagonists stop in at a local church to get out of the rain. This sneakily introduces a bunch of factors about the world that are actually quite interesting. First, the church. While mentioned in passing elsewhere, this is the first real time that we deal with the church in regards to Holo. While she doesn't see herself as a god or deity, her beliefs don't matter to others. So knowing that the church is not at all pleased with pagan villages and their animal gods, here we see Holo wearing a thick robe to disguise herself, going with the story that she has burned her face to keep her hood up and cover her wolf ears and tail. I personally enjoy this part. Like, the author could have stated that Holo can transform into a human without any animal features at all, allowing her to blend in completely. However, they chose not to, which adds complexity. Our characters must now consider these characteristics of hers, and it adds this additional depth to the world. So we're staying at this church for the night. Holo is covering up, and the pair spend some time talking to a local lord for the evening. This part here is also great world building. Said lord owns and runs a vineyard, and he seems to have no issues talking with Lawrence and enjoying his company. While there may be nobility in this world, their social status is not so strict as to stop this lord from conversing with a traveling merchant, who, at least as far as most merchant hierarchies go, is near the bottom of the totem pole. I mean, there's also a discussion here about buying stock on margin and exchange transactions, but before we get too bogged down into that, look, fan service! After the Lord goes to bed, the actual story arc begins. A young merchant named Zeren introduces himself to the pair and offers a proposal. He has learned that a local coin is soon to be reminted with a different amount of silver. This reminting would alter its value when compared to other currencies, essentially making this coin worth more during currency exchanges. This is a good example of real economic elements in this story, since this happens in real life too. You see, real coins are made with certain types of metals, and over the generations, those metals have changed to suit the economy. This is because it's better to have coins made from material that is cheaper than the coin's actual value. If you had a nickel worth only 5 cents, but it was made out of pure silver, someone would want to make a profit by melting it down and selling the silver, because the silver more than likely is worth more than 5 cents. Additionally, it doesn't make any sense for any government to spend more money making a coin than the coin is worth. I should preface all of this, and probably this entire video, by saying, I'm a video producer. I am not an economist. And sure, governments have made laws forbidding the melting of currency, and even today, most countries have very strict laws on the defacement of money. But back in the day, it was just far easier to change a currency's materials over time to meet the needs of its people. So what does that mean for our protagonists in this situation? Well, as Zeren brings up and as Lawrence confirms, let's say that you know about the local mint changing the quality of silver in their currency. Specifically, you know beforehand that they plan to raise the quality of silver in the currency. Well, then you could gather a whole bunch of the currency up before the change, and then once the swap over happens, you exchange the old version for the new version at a 1-to-1 ratio, gaining more actual silver since the new coins have more in it. Zeren's Gambit is that in exchange for the information on which silver coin is being changed, he wants a percentage of the profit that Lawrence makes, which sounds reasonable, assuming that everything he speaks is true. Too bad for him that Holo's ears are very good at detecting lies, though too bad for Lawrence, she's not so good at it that she's able to pinpoint exactly what in his explanation is a lie, just that there is a deception somewhere. Is it with the coin, the profit, or something more fundamental about the deal itself? They're in the dark. In general, it would be best for them to ignore Zeren. They should continue with their business and forget the conversation ever happened. They could pretend that Zeren was just trying to involve them in a doomed situation, like a multi-level marketing scheme or something. But Lawrence, being a merchant himself, doesn't want to do that. He knows he's being lied to, so he believes that if he stays vigilant, he can uncover what the lie is and use it to his advantage, especially since he has Holo, the wise wolf, to assist him. I mean, it helps that said wise wolf also owes him now, since he has spoiled her with cheese-covered baked potatoes. But before we continue discussing silver quantities and Lawrence's potential profit from deception, though, let's address this narrative and how it presents economics. Specifically, what the audience can learn from it, or rather, what we don't learn. Talks about economics, even if they are fantasy medieval economics, are without a doubt a central core of Spice and Wolf's story. The narrative heavily relies on it to drive the plot forward. But this reliance also drives some audience members away. Let's look beyond Hasakura's work, right, into his passions, with the exception to writing. They all seem to revolve around exploring topics of economic value. That and also the collection of wealth. If Spice and Wolf were a one-off, and this was the only series that he wrote which touched on it, I could have said that maybe it was just a passing interest for him. But if you've gone on to read other works, let's say that you've read World End Economica, a visual novel from 2014, you will know that this, for him, is less of a passing interest and more of an obsessive hobby, one that he then uses in his works to further explore. He knows more than the average person about economics, and many times he tries to work all that he does know into his writing. That said, reading Spice and Wolf, and really any of his works, does not in any way equal taking an economics course. Holo and Lawrence's banter won't teach you about modern economics. It won't help you with the stock market. It won't teach you how to diversify your assets. In fact, Hasakura himself laments about failed investments in the author's notes after many a volume, which no doubt then helped to fuel some of the economic disasters that his characters later faced. Reading Spice and Wolf won't improve your understanding of economics. In certain circumstances, it might confuse you even more. Heck, you might even need an economics degree to comprehend some of the characters' predicaments. Like the amount of times that I have seen write-ups explaining the first few economic arcs of the show is almost a testament to how little the audience understood. Myself included, of course. My first time watching Spice and Wolf was, again, when I was 18. I had no background in economics. Heck, I could barely rub two toonies together most of the time. So the best I could do is watch this narrative, see that the characters are in some kind of financial peril, and then even after hearing the characters explain it, the best I could do is stoically respond, "Ah, so desu ne." But hey, here's the solution. If you want to try and understand the economics from this series, find what you don't understand and then research it. It sounds so simple when I say it out loud. Why do you do this? Because with how Spice and Wolf presents things, there is likely a realistic take on the character's economic activities. So you can just look it up. And let's say you do. Let's say you go out and you get a copy of Gold and Spices, The Rise of Commerce in the Middle Ages by Jean Favier. Hasakura himself mentions that this book is an influence for Spice and Wolf. So then let's say you go and you read it. You read about a similar tale to that of the Silver Purity storyline, one that really happened in Florence in the 14th century, albeit on a much shorter scale. Let's say you read about the importance of money changers and why the introduction of Weiss, the Cambionist, was important for the audience to understand his trade. You see all of these connections, all of these real-world representations, and after all of that, you can respond by going, "Ah, so desu ne." In reality, there is much to learn from Spice and Wolf, but most of it will come off as uninteresting and somewhat unnecessary to a not insignificant amount of the audience. If this was a story only about trade, foreign currencies, buying products to ship and making a profit, I doubt many would care. It's not like everyone watching this has at one point found themselves fighting the 0.01 ISK game in Jita 4.4. If you know, you know. But do you know what does boost this at times bogged down in narrative of microeconomics? Banter, specifically that of our main characters. Holo might not know about the ins and outs of the mercantile trade, thus making her a near-perfect audience surrogate for Lawrence to explain the inner workings of things. Unfortunately, most of us are not Holo the Wise Wolf, so we are unable to understand the minutiae like she can. But we could still watch, read, or listen with glee as she skillfully takes her newfound knowledge to verbally assault Lawrence. Their spats are what makes this narrative entertaining above all else. Now, I know that I just spent a good amount of time over the last few minutes talking about how most of the nitty-gritty economics of this show are moot for the average watcher or reader. But since we're here, let's try to explain what's going on. Anyway, going back to the silver. As it turns out, the lies told to our protagonists were only in part. Holo, with her super hearing, determines that the currency's silver content would be decreased, not increased. We also learn that Zeren is only a bit player in a much larger scheme by the Medio Trading Company, who plan to gather a bunch of old coins for their own gain. Now, the existing coins have a particular amount of silver in them, as we have established. The value of that coin will always be in some way tied to the value of silver on its own. It'll always have a true value, if you will. But all of the currencies also have a kind of face value that comes from the trust that people have in the coin. That face value fluctuates with how much trust people have in it. Like, people don't want to use a currency that might disappear tomorrow. They don't want to have stockpiles of a coin that is going to be worthless. So trust is important. In general, for Spice and Wolf, the more silver a coin has, the more trustworthy it is as a currency. It means that the country making these coins is stable enough that the coins won't disappear, and the value of the materials used to make the coin determines its trustworthiness. The old Trenny coin, in this case, has a lot of trust built into it due to its silver content. But if that silver content decreases in the new Trenny coin, people will perceive the coin to be less trustworthy, less valuable, and then the value of all Trenny coins will shift. What you need to consider, and what I honestly feel like the anime does a bad job with, is how coins are made and why that's important. The silver has to come from somewhere. In this case, the King of Trenny should have his own goals for changing the purity of his coins. And I mean, I say the anime is bad at explaining this, but the light novel has the same problem to an extent. It just has more words to attempt to explain everything. So the King of Trenny wants to decrease the silver content in his coin. Why? Well, it is assumed that he is doing this because he needs or wants more coins, more money. How does he make more money? He goes to the mint and he makes more coins. But if he doesn't have enough silver to mint the amount of coins that he needs, he has to drop the silver content. Not only that, but he has to also collect a bunch of the old coins and then melt them down for more silver. If he does that sneakily, then people won't notice right away. So in the short term, he just massively increased the amount of money that he has as a monarch. You know, until somebody finds out about it. The Medio Company's gambit is that they want to stockpile the old coin. They then use that stock to bargain with the monarch. He's forced to bargain because he needs a bunch of the old coin to make the new coin. But Medio is not wanting to profit off of the coin itself necessarily. Rather, they want to use its physical value as silver. They want to trade to the king the old coin in exchange for favors, in exchange for lower taxes. They want a bunch of privileges that other trading companies won't get. Privileges that will lead to profit in other ways. If they do that, they get those benefits. The king gets his stock of the old coin to make down and makes himself richer for whatever reasons that he wants, and everybody is happy. The confusing bit to this, though, is how Medio goes about getting that coin. Like, why is it that them lying about the silver purity will cause things to go in their favor? Well, they are lying to get people to give them more coins. It's confusing. The Medio Trading Company is using people like Zeren to spread a rumor. The rumor is that the silver content will increase, not decrease. This works in their favor because any decrease happens gradually. Lawrence explains that there is always a small change in the value of a currency before a bigger change. This small change helps gauge how best to implement things without causing major disruptions to the economy. The Medio Company goes around spreading the rumor that the silver content is going to increase. Merchants like Lawrence hear this rumor and then buy up a bunch of the Trenny coin. They are made to believe that the coin will increase in value and they will profit on the difference. However, after they buy things up, money changers like Weiss will eventually notice the slight change downwards in purity, sounding the alarm before the much more massive change. This will lead to all of these merchants suddenly desperate to drop their stock of the coin before its value drops below what they paid to get it. And who would they sell it to? Medio, who will then take that stock and increase their hoard and use it as leverage against the king. This is their initial gambit. But how would one that knows all of that profit all of it? How can Lawrence and Holo, who know about all of this, profit off of it? Well, they can go to a rival trading company and convince them of the Gambit. They can convince them to collect more Trenny coins than Medio and put the squeeze on the king themselves. Lawrence decides to call in the Milone Company, as he has just recently sold his stock of furs to them. And they are the only company that he has ties to who could capitalize on this opportunity. With his assistance, the Milone Company follows Zeren to verify the existence of the Gambit. They then start gathering Trenny coins for the negotiations with the king, more than likely gathering it at even a faster rate than Medio could due to the sizes in their operations. Lawrence and Holo can now relax and wait for the deal to complete. Simple, right? There's only one problem. It was very easy for Milone to follow Zeren and confirm the authenticity of the Silver Gambit. However, it would be just as easy for Medio to follow Lawrence and Holo and uncover their plans. With Milone now in the game, Medio are backed into a corner because Milone can stockpile things faster than they can, but what can Medio possibly do to stop them? Well, I mean, they could tarnish their opponent's reputation, but it would take more than bad-mouthing them in public. They'd need something more drastic and concrete than that. I know! Why not convince the church and accuse them of heresy? That would do it. And surprisingly, the troublesome merchant causing them problems has a companion whose name matches that of a nearby pagan deity. That would be of interest to the church, wouldn't it? So Medio attempts to kidnap Lawrence and Holo from their room at the inn. But thankfully, due to Holo's hearing once again, they are able to escape from the building safely. Time, however, is not on their side. They need a safe harbor, and the Milone Company is as safe as any. But running there is dangerous. There's a mob of men on their tails. So Holo proposes a plan. Split the party. Holo will run as a distraction and Lawrence can escape and get help. He's the only one of the two of them with any leverage at all in order to get help, and if she gets captured, they can still rescue her before her ears and tail are discovered. Shame that they don't realize that the Medio Company already knows about her. They capture Holo, and the plan is to blackmail the Milone Company in order to get them to back off. If they refuse, they will hand Holo to the church, and then the church will accuse them all of heresy. But how could they possibly know? Holo kept her ears and tail hidden. It's not like everyone makes note of all the various pagan deities enough to recognize Holo's name immediately. Unless one of the merchants working with Medio happens to hail from Pazlaw. Chloe informs Medio of Holo's true nature, and while it's questionable info, they are backed into a corner enough to believe it, only for then Holo's ears and tail to be revealed after her capture. So now, they have to hope that the fear of the church will keep the Milone Company out of their way. But money is money. Milone is not going to turn down this profit. So they help Lawrence launch a rescue operation, one that almost failed, if not for Holo realizing that she is endangering Lawrence, this fragile human she has grown fond of. So she decides to protect him from the hunters and from Chloe by turning into a wolf and running away. Without Holo, Medio can't turn her into the church, and then Milone can rush to the king with the coin that they have and strike a deal. But to Lawrence, that doesn't matter anymore, because Holo is gone, and he can't run after her, and he is left alone. But that's fine, because she wants more apples and patiently waits for him to wake up. Then she'll make him sweat by having him think she's left, only to spring the bill on him for some food. Oh, that Holo. And our protagonists go to their next adventure of financial success and ruin. I know those last few minutes of my recap like, skipped over a bunch of the narrative, technically. I mean, the whole time from capture to rescue is like 2.5 episodes of the anime alone. There was planning with Malone, there was the initial recapture of Holo, and then there was a bunch of time keeping out of sight in the sewers. It's easy to overlook all of that stuff, because the narrative presentation in the anime is thrilling, even if little actually happens if you were to write it all down. I mean, I even glossed over the reintroduction of Chloe as well. For reasons, because I want to talk about her a little bit more later when it's more relevant. So just keep her in the back of your head, and we will continue with the natural narrative progression. So now our protagonists have reached the other side of the Silver Gambit. They are not rich, but also not without scars. Because of the speed in which Malone had to act when dealing with the king, they had to accept less favorable terms than they could have otherwise. This left Lawrence with a much lower percentage of profit than he was expecting. In fact, he made less on the Silver Gambit than he did from the furs that he sold to Malone when he first arrived. But he was alive, and no one was accused of heresy by the church, so win-win, eh? But what happens when we don't win? What happens when Lawrence and Holo are unable to notice when they get swindled? What happens when they end up in a much larger hole than the one they just escaped out of? Unlike the last arc, this one is thankfully much more straightforward. Last time we messed about with coin purity, spending a lot of time with our characters talking about what could happen elsewhere, like what some distant king we never meet plans to do and why all of that is important. This time around, we get a lot more personal, because it's time for a heist. Or rather, a reverse heist, because we get to smuggle some gold. We now find our protagonists on the road with a lighter purse, but a carriage full of pepper, which is a step above where we left them after spending time with, some sewers and heartache. Lawrence explains that pepper is better than coin, because he can sell it for even more up north. They use pepper up there to prep their meats for the upcoming winter, so they will buy it. The pair waltz up to a new trading company at their initial destination and do some fancy negotiating in order to sell the pepper. Holo helps in these negotiations by pointing out that they are trading with rigged scales. The merchant from the local trading company is using slanted scales that only balance on the uneven table, depending on how the scale is rotated. This allows it to look accurate while Lawrence is checking the scale, but inaccurate once the actual weighing of the pepper takes place. Lawrence uses this info to strike an amazing deal for himself on some armor, essentially blackmailing the merchant with the threat to his reputation. But Lawrence is so cocky that he doesn't notice that the untrustworthy merchant screws them even harder in the process. But our overconfident Lawrence won't realize this until far later. Instead, they travel on, and he spends some of his money on making his traveling companion happy. He stops by to see his old master at the Merchant Guild, a master who, in the manga, sees the danger ahead of his young protege long before Lawrence ever does. And finally, the pair head off to sell their new stock of armor. Now, back when he traded in the pepper with the sketchy guy, Lawrence decided to get ahead of things. He does this by once again doing trade with stock rather than coin, similar to how he got the pepper in the first place. In this case, he decided he wanted a bunch of armor, with the reasoning that, well, up north, the church runs a yearly military campaign to go a-conquering and spreading the good word of the Lord. It's a campaign that needs armor for its soldiers. Turns out, though, that said yearly campaign got canceled, so the value of armor has tanked. So, on the surface, this is just bad luck for Lawrence. I mean, prices go down all the time. It comes with the territory. But what is the far larger problem is that Lawrence got cocky and acquired additional armor from the sneaky merchant on credit. That credit is a debt that is now due, but Lawrence's whole stock is worthless and he's broke. Let's explain this in a little more detail because, every major arc of this show has some level of economic complications. So here's what Lawrence thought was going to happen. He and Holo go to this local trading company in Porosit to sell his stock of pepper that they got from the previous story. The merchant there attempts to swindle them, but because Holo pays attention, he fails at that. And now, because Lawrence believes that he has this guy's balls in a vice, he's gonna demand extra concessions in exchange for not ruining this guy's reputation. In retrospect, he should have done it anyway. But for the sake of ease here, we're gonna use some fake dollar amounts to explain, since the narrative isn't always that clear. Lawrence trades his $100 worth of pepper for $100 worth of armor. He currently believes that the price of armor in Porosin to be $10 a set, so he gets 10 sets of armor. He additionally forces this merchant to credit him an extra 10 sets of armor for the same price of $100. Lawrence now owes this Porosin trading company $100 for the extra armor, but that's okay, he thinks. Lawrence's plan is to transport all of the armor further north, to the city of Reuvenhagen. This is the place where the annual military campaign we mentioned takes place. There, he believes that the price of armor will go for $20 a set, so his 20 sets will come to $400 total. After that, then he pays off his $100 debt to the Porosin Trading Company, leaving him with $300 profit. $200 more than the $100 he would have got if all he did was sell the pepper. That was the plan. But the Porosin merchant knew things that Lawrence didn't. Namely, that the Northern campaign got cancelled and that armor was worth far less than $10 a set. In reality, once our protagonists reach Reuvenhagen, we learn that the armor they thought they could sell for $20 each now is only worth $1 each. So instead of getting $400 for his load of armor, he can only get $20. Not including the tax of armor that he had to pay to cross the border into Reuvenhagen. So it's even less than that. But he still owes the Porosin Trading Company for the $100 of credit. Not to be outdone, that company then traded Lawrence's debt to the local Remelio company. Remelio themselves are desperate for any semblance of income in order to fix their own problems after the armor trade crash. But being locals to the area, specifically where Lawrence now is, Remelio are in a position to be able to imprison Lawrence or sell him into hard labor if he does not pay back his debt. Lawrence now doesn't have many places to turn. His own trading guild can't shoulder his debt because it would set a bad precedent. They don't want any merchant in the guild thinking that they can make some reckless business decisions and then have the guild pay for it. Also, while Lawrence could have gotten some loans from other local merchants in town, none of them take kindly to Lawrence begging for money when he has a pretty woman at his side, which leads to Lawrence lashing out in the completely wrong direction. At this point, we haven't commented on Lawrence and Holo's relationship to a large degree. Yes, they travel together, and Holo is learning a bunch of new things about how the world has changed in the decades since she last traveled, but that fondness for one another hasn't really grown beyond a particular point. In romance terms, because hey, we all know where this is inevitably headed, they're like at the point where they may be dating, but definitely not exclusive. Things could still change, and they could part ways without too much emotional heartache. It's at this stage in their relationship where Lawrence is at the lowest point that he's ever been. And in that moment, his mind has one of those split-second bad thoughts. Thoughts like, if only Holo hadn't pointed out the bad scales, then I would only be out a bit of pepper and not on this path to a labor camp for the rest of my life. If Holo wasn't with me, maybe some of these merchants could have given me enough to work with. If only Holo wasn't here. And he stupidly vocalizes these thoughts in a fit of madness. Thankfully for him, Holo, the wise wolf of Yotsu, is not so run by her emotions that this is the beginning of the end. She's hurt, of course, but is wise enough to realize that Lawrence is in a very bad place, and that they instead need to work and get him out of it. She still has her own debt to him after all. Leaving now would solve nothing, and they would both just have regrets. They need a plan to pay off the debt, and even better, make a profit. This is where Nora comes in. We didn't mention Nora earlier. We could have, but it would have been a bit of a distraction instead of talking about the whole, debt thing. Nora is a young shepherdess who, alongside her dog, currently works for the church. Her job is herding sheep, specifically in the areas surrounding Reuvenhagen. Lawrence and Holo meet Nora on the way into the city as the main road got blocked off by some mercenary groups going through, and Lawrence and Holo decide to take the quote-unquote riskier path through the woods. Risky for, the other people who are afraid of the local wolf population. Holo does not give a care about these young wolf cubs, so the path is actually perfectly fine for them. They meet Nora on the way through because even though the church is so loving and so compassionate, they also dislike the fact that this young girl is so good at her job. She obviously must be a witch or something to be that good. So let's keep giving her the dangerous routes and fields for her sheep. That way, either she will die or she'll fail enough to be put further into debt with the church for life. Because the church. But Nora herself has dreams of being a weaver and working with clothing. The problem is, besides owing a bunch to the church, is that she can't afford the fees needed for the crafting guilds. Because of this, she is taken to guiding travelers and offering protection against wolves for extra coin. Since, again, she is quite good at her job. Holo doesn't believe they need her because obviously wolves won't be bothering them. But Lawrence sees a benefit in taking the young girl along because you never know when someone with her skills could be helpful, only for him to realize later just how useful those skills are once he gets backed into a corner. So back to the present, Lawrence is drowning in debt. The market is in tatters, so most plans to get wealth are dead on arrival, but Lawrence does have this young shepherdess who is almost as desperate to make money as they are, so Lawrence concocts a scheme that is not necessarily legal. The city of Reuvenhagen is largely controlled by the church. As such, there are many rules for what can and cannot be imported, as well as the tax for all of these items. In particular, the cost for importing gold is so high that most never bother. There's no profit in gold because anything that you could gain is taxed away immediately coming through the border gate. But if you happened to have a way to smuggle the gold into the city, things might be a little different. Like, say, if you hid the gold in the stomachs of some sheep. Sheep that come into the city through the church's own back gates, no less. Well, the lack of gold sellers in the town means that you could make a massive profit there. You just need initial capital. So, Lawrence goes to his debtors, the Remelio Company, and he gets them to fund his scheme. They are in just as much desperation to save their near-bankrupt company, so whatever they might have left should be enough to buy gold cheaply in a nearby town and then selling it in Reuvenhagen to bring them back into the green. After, forgiving Lawrence of his own debt, of course. So that's what they do. Lawrence convinces Nora of the deal and entices her with her own cut of the profit, a cut that could see her walk away from the church entirely and have enough coin for the guild dues besides. And they all set off alongside a Remelio representative to a nearby town and buy gold. Problems don't occur until the way back. Much more dramatic that way. Because this whole scheme of Lawrence's counts on two obvious things that everybody is aware of, and one not as obvious thing that becomes apparent when it happens. First, wolves. Their path to the nearby town and back is dangerous, and while the wolves let them through the first time, the local big daddy wolf of the area is not keen on this other female wolf running through his territory like she owns the place. So Holo needs to break off from the group and go teach that young pup not to mess with the god of wheat. The second thing is the gates and the church. The goal is to have the sheep swallow all of the gold before entering the city, and then pay a local butcher under the table to have them slaughtered and the gold passed along to wherever it needs to go. But there are plenty of points of failure here. Luckily for our group, none of those failures come to pass, mostly because of number 3. Remelio is just as, if not more desperate to escape bankruptcy as Lawrence, and they figure that if something happens to this upstart traveling merchant, then I mean, they could just take his share of the whole thing, right? Also, I mean, lucky for them that at the time that the band of mercenaries they send meet up with the group, Holo's already snuck off to deal with the wolves, and this leaves Lawrence unprotected. Unlucky for them, though, Holo is quite quick. She speedily gives the young wolf pup a talking to, and then returns to the group to see what the heck is going on. Now these mercenaries have a giant wolf to contend with. Afterwards, though, Lawrence decides to forgive the Remelio representative for his backstabbing, and they all get the gold into the city safely. So the day is saved. Nora gets to be free of the church and start her new career with the crafting guild. Lawrence is debt-free with some spare change besides. He and Holo have made up, at least for now, because, hey, Lawrence has been mighty friendly with that young shepherdess, and the 1,000-year-old wolf god might be a tad bit jealous, especially because she was unable to hear who Lawrence called out for help during the previous kerfuffle. Perhaps she thinks he might want the warmth and company of his own kind. But Lawrence is a merchant, and not only does he legitimately appreciate the company of the she-wolf god, but she is also a lovely trump card on his way to becoming a city merchant with his own store. So they continue their travels together, heading further north in search of Holo's former home. The smuggling arc brings about the end of the show's first initial season. We get the lovely starting interactions of our main duo, but it's not without its relationship conflicts, mostly because both arcs love to throw a wrench in the pair's possible romantic relationship by always having another woman in the story to vie, even unknowingly, for Lawrence's affections. The show goes so far as to even gender bend a rival merchant just to have a second romantic option for Lawrence in the initial arc for some reason. I'm sure that's not going to come up again. But then, the next arc... Well, actually, the next arc depends on which medium you are following. If you are an anime watcher and dive straight into Season 2, it won't be long until you reach an arc about a young merchant named Amati. Also, the lovely conflict that he introduces to the show's dynamic. That arc only happens like 2 episodes in, 3 if you watch the OVA episodes that bring Nora back for a bit. But as an anime watcher, you might be surprised to hear that the manga has a completely different next arc in mind. Why the manga decided to skip this bit? Well, I can only guess. It's even worse because the manga skips over Amati to bring our protagonists to the church in Terrio, but then the anime skips over Terrio, and both adaptations find ways around the fact that they did such a thing. But continuing down our chronological anime path brings us to the town of Kimmerson. This is probably the most and least important arc of the early story. It depends on what parts of the narrative that you personally enjoy. Because, as the manga proved, you can skip this arc entirely and just get away with a couple of flashbacks to the important bits briefly as an aside. I'm not happy that the manga did that because Dion as a character is fascinating, so downgrading her to an off-screen acquaintance is blasphemy. But I cannot say, despite being able to ignore the arc from a narrative perspective, that it is not enjoyable and in some ways, thrilling. This arc introduces Amati. He is a young upstart merchant from a good family who challenges Lawrence to a merchant's duel. But unlike the previous arcs where profit was the goal here is love and reputation. For you see, the young Amati does not want Lawrence's coin, nor does he want to make a profit off of Lawrence's misfortune. Far from it, actually. Instead, after several polite conversations, Amati has become hopelessly smitten with Lawrence's beautiful traveling companion. Then, after hearing from her own mouth the tale of woe and debt that is shackling her to Lawrence, Amati decides to act as the noble knight. He decides to save her from her debt by buying her out and freeing her from the clutches of the evil Lawrence, thus displaying his love. In reality, and not in Amati's little dream fantasy fueled by puppy dog love, we, the audience, see that this situation is laughable. True, the relationship between our protagonists is not utterly rock solid. Holo still has worries about how far Lawrence really plans to take her, but it still should be strong enough to weather the storm from some young man who doesn't even know Holo's secret. A young man who also has not promised to take her north. So the most likely outcome, we think, is that Amati will go off and, pay Holo's debt that she herself probably inflated, and Holo will just continue traveling north with Lawrence, with coins to spare for food and other luxurious travel amenities. Unless Lawrence and Holo get into a fight, because Lawrence hasn't been speaking to her 100% honestly. He knows things about their adventure that she does not, and that causes problems. From here forward with this arc, we can split it into two parts. The part about Amati and his scheme to come up with 1,000 silver to pay off Holo's debt, and then the arguably more important part involving a bird and a horde of lost stories that might include hints about Holo's past. Let's start with that second one. So, what does Lawrence know that Holo doesn't? This is something that does not get mentioned in all versions of the story. Lawrence had actually heard of Holo's home, the place that she wants to go to, Yotsu, before meeting Holo. Granted, it was only a passing mention, he heard it on the road, but what he overheard was that Yotsu was destroyed. He doesn't tell Holo this because he wants to spare her feelings. Oh yeah, you know that homeland you desperately want to travel back to? Yeah, I heard it's gone now. Tough luck. No, he's not going to just tell her that. She might be devastated. Also, then she might not have a reason to travel north with him anymore. And their adventures might end, which would be sad for him. In Kimmerson, he gets introduced to the local chronicler, a woman named Dion, who specializes in tales about pagan gods. Lawrence asks her to investigate through her library of dank tomes for information regarding Yotsu's location. She does confirm for him, though, that as far as she knows, Yotsu is indeed gone, destroyed by a moon hunting bear. Whatever that is. Lawrence then takes his leave, but Dion will eventually follow up with him about more that she learns. She does this by sending a letter to the inn in which he stays, but he thinks, this is fine. Holo has already admitted to him to not being able to read, so it's not like a letter about her destroyed homeland will be an issue, unless she can read. And, she was just claiming that she could not read as a jest to make fun of Lawrence later, and that would make her learn about her home in the worst possible way. Not only does she learn about it, but then she deduces that Lawrence has known all along, and that he might have been playing her for a fool. All of a sudden, the idea that she will continue traveling with Lawrence is no longer as sure of a thing. Amati, though he doesn't realize it, has a massive opening here. And he can take Holo away from Lawrence now. And that's scary. So while Lawrence himself is reeling from this new information, he decides, no. He needs to end this problem in the only way he knows how. He needs to stop Amati from gaining capital and buying out Holo's debt, because if he doesn't, Lawrence might lose her forever. So let's now move into Amati's fundraising plan involving our brand new meme stock called Pyrite. So the merchant scheme for this arc is a little bit easier to understand for the general public now, rather than, back when the light novel came out and even when the anime was first airing. And this is because there are far more examples of this sort of thing happening to the average person in recent times. Remember all that stuff with GameStop stock? Remember people trying to explain the basics of Bitcoin? Heck, as a Canadian, there's an extremely good 2-part documentary on YouTube about Nortel that covers similar things. Add that to your watch later list. So this arc has the Pyrite scheme, sometimes called the Fool's Gold scheme, because that's what Pyrite is. It's not a made-up thing for Spice and Wolf like the Trenny coin or anything. Pyrite is an actual material that you could get. What happens here is that some old lady fortune teller comes to town hawking these small pieces of pyrite, and she claims that they give good luck and fortune. like what some people claim that they do in real life. While normally that might not end up doing, like, anything, some off-screen things happen to make at least a portion of this city's population believe that these rocks actually have magical powers. Perhaps a few of them got lucky in love after buying one of these pieces of pyrite. So then others, seeking the same luck, will now buy this previously worthless rock for good luck. But here's the thing. There's only a certain amount of pyrite available in town. So what is essentially a bidding war for the remaining pyrite starts to happen. If you want pyrite, and suddenly a bunch of people do, you have to go to the people who already have some and offer coin. And if someone is willing to offer more than you, well, that's what it's worth now. The value of pyrite is not anything related to the object's value. No, the pyrite is only worth what somebody else is willing to pay for it. People are willing to pay a lot. The real magic with the pyrite scheme occurs shortly afterwards. Specifically when the merchants in town realize, hey, this rock was like only worth a silver a few days ago, and now it's worth 5 times that. And the price keeps going up. We should get in on that. And now it's not just people buying it because they want a lucky rock. It becomes an investment opportunity because the people buying it are assuming and hoping that the value of the pyrite will continue to rise. Buy one piece of pyrite for $1 today, sell it for $5 or $10 tomorrow. Keep the profit. Easy money. But everybody knows the inevitable end of all of this. A crash will come. The price only keeps going up because people keep buying at these really ridiculously high prices. But eventually someone will balk at the price. I mean, you have merchants who have now tied up their entire profit margins in this rock. So eventually they will need to buy other things. They will need to cash out on their pyrite and buy things like wheat for food and tools for work. They need those things to live. And then if you have too many people selling their pyrite, though, it'll add more pyrite to the market, make more of it available, and the value will drop because, well, there's more available to sell. The price will go down. And then those who are holding on to pyrite purely to make money will get scared. Because if they wait too long, everybody else will have sold off their stock, and this rock that they bought for $1 each will suddenly only be worth 50 cents. They will lose money, and no one wants to be left holding the bag. But somebody always gets left holding the bag. Amati's goal is to, at the end of the day, have 1,000 silver to buy out Holo's debt from Lawrence. He could get that silver any way he wants, but he has chosen to buy into the pyrite trade early. He needs the price to go up to a particular point so that when he cashes out, the profit makes up the remaining funds that he needs for the buyout. If the pyrite reaches that value, he wins, gets the money, and presumably makes off with Holo in marriage. They even have a signed marriage contract to light a fire under Lawrence's ass. But if the pyrite never makes it that high, if the price crashes before then, well, Amati loses some money, but really what he loses here is pride. This is not like the previous arc where Lawrence was on the edge of destitution. Even the worst case here will not put Amati in debt. Heck, even Lawrence's worst case with the pyrite is that he doesn't get money from Amati. Or he does, and then he's up 1,000 silver. There's no financial risk to either of them in this arc, really. But for the first time, there doesn't need to be. The stakes are high regardless, as both of their prides as merchants are on the line, and Holo's future sits in the middle. Because really, that's what this is about here. There is an underlying aspect of the seasoning of a merchant, as it were, in this arc, and it's played through with different examples. Amati is the young upstart, trying to make a name for himself. Lawrence is the more experienced trader, but by no means master at his craft, as he is still only a traveling merchant and not yet successful enough to start his own store. Then, there is also Lawrence's Kimmerson contact, the merchant Mark. Mark used to be a traveling merchant himself, but due to some good luck several years back, he had enough capital to start his own store. Sure, it's just a tent in the business area of town, but it's a heck of a lot more stable than, roaming around on the countryside with a cart, only to find out that your wagon of armor is now worthless. So when Amati goes to the guild hall and challenges Lawrence with a blood contract for Holo's debt, he's not just doing it because he has fallen for Holo. That's a part of it, but I don't feel like that's the whole story. He's doing it for the prestige. He's doing it to massively increase his own reputation in the area in a very short amount of time. He walks into the trading guild in front of all assembled there and makes his declaration that he will raise 1,000 silver in a day, while also winning the affections of the girl that he likes. Sure, he accepts the risk that she might not stay with him after the fact, but even then, he still wins, because if he pays off her debt and she doesn't stay, he has still proven to everybody in attendance that as a merchant, he could raise 1,000 silver in a very small amount of time and still not be destitute. And if he did it once, he can do it again. He's flexing. And Lawrence agrees to this at the start, not just because he hasn't fought with Holo yet and their relationship is still solid in his mind, but he also has the social pressure of the entire guild now to show this upstart that he's overextended. They want Lawrence to make him learn an important lesson about being too cocky in their trade. And Amati is extremely cocky, which leads to the other big thing that Lawrence can do when he realizes he really wants Amati to fail. This leads to the second scheme of the arc. It's a smaller one, but no less important. The futures contract. Lawrence and Holo have had their spat, and Lawrence now believes in the possibility that Holo will leave him for Amati if he fails. So the day before their battle at the marketplace, Lawrence confronts Amati. He says, "Hey, I'd like to order from you 500 silver worth of pyrite at tonight's price. You pay me now or before the market opens in the morning, and I'll deliver the pyrite to you after the market closes tomorrow." There's no benefit for Amati to take this deal. Unless, of course, he's already won. Locking in the price of pyrite to this moment of the deal means that one of them is going to be forced to lose even more than they already would have. Lawrence is essentially telling Amati, double the hell down and risk even more of your starting capital. So here's how the future contracts work, assuming I got this right. If the price of pyrite rises in that day, Amati will still get a set amount of pyrite from Lawrence, prepaid for at the lower price. Lawrence, assuming he doesn't already have the pyrite, would then need to buy the pyrite at a loss in order to give it to Amati. Ultimately, this would just put more pyrite in Amati's pocket that he has purchased for less than he could sell it for, and he gets even more profit on top of what he needs to pay off Holo's debt. But if the price goes down, well then Amati gets a bag of worthless rocks that he paid far too much for. He's not in debt, but once again his pride is on the line, and Lawrence successfully goads him into accepting this deal. Now this deal is a benefit for Lawrence because he is hoping, really hoping, for Amati to overextend even more than he already did. He knows that Amati has a decent amount of starting capital, but if he has to give a bunch of that away to Lawrence early for the futures contract, then he will need to have the price of pyrite rise even more now to make up the difference. Lawrence then thinks he has another trick up his sleeve that might be able to help. Remember that chronicler, Dion? Well, she lives in the Alchemist district. She also has contacts with all of the craftsmen there, and Lawrence asks if she can negotiate with them for their stocks of pyrite. If he gets that from them, well, he can flood the market with the stuff and force a crash, causing Amati to lose. The only problem is that Dion informs Lawrence that somebody has already been by for the exact same thing. She will have to see if that first buyer is willing to part with the pyrite before the market closes, which gets Lawrence thinking. Was it Amati? Did he gain even more pyrite and lower the amount that he needs to make enough money? These are the worries that Lawrence has going into the market that next day. The tension here is really some of the best in the entire narrative. Again, it's a shame that the manga skipped over this at all, in all honesty. Lawrence is biding his time at the market board, watching the price of pyrite slowly rise. He is waiting for the right time to sell his own stock, and possibly the alchemist's stock as well from Dion, before Amati waltzes up to the market and dumps his own. Frustratingly, he also sees that Holo is at the market that day, but she's hanging around Amati, not him. Has he already lost? Oh, not at all. When Lawrence finally decides to go in and sell his stock of pyrite, Holo just dumps a big bag of it right down next to him. Because she was the buyer of the alchemist's stock, not Amadi. And between the two of them, they cause a pyrite crash. Amadi fails to gain enough capital in order to buy out Holo, but he receives a bag of worthless rocks from Lawrence for his trouble. Holo, after their spat, just needed a bit of time to cool off before realizing that, yes, she still wants to go north to whatever is left of Yotsu. She wants to go north with Lawrence. He might have kept information from her, but she realized he didn't do it out of malice. It also helps that he is now committed to traveling with her. She also happened to overhear him talking to Dion about what's the possibility of demigods and humans becoming couples with one another? And why would he ask about that, I wonder? Now she has oh so much more to tease him about. And the pair continue on their merry way. I know the end of this arc doesn't, in how I can describe it, sound as dramatic as it really is. My summary is nowhere near as good as it was built up on the page or in the anime, but that's okay, because this is a retrospective. You are only reliving the experience of the narrative for the first time, right? You have already read the light novel or watched the show before, haven't you? So now the manga comes back in and the anime dips out. Next, we get to talk about Terrio, the church, and the information about Yotsu and Holo's home contained there. The anime skips this for reasons? I have some theories about that, but we'll get to it. The manga doesn't skip this though, so I'm going to try to use that for visual representations. Hopefully that'll work well enough. This is actually the first arc without a really big major mercantile deal, scheme, or problem for our characters. There is a minor one at the end involving buybacks and political pressures between towns, but nothing of the same stakes of arcs previous. There's actually even a point where our characters consider just running away when things get difficult, because it's not like there are any consequences to that. But the breather from massive consequences is nice, especially since there'll be more of that down the road, more than likely. Our duo make their way into the town of Terrio. They are following a lead that they got from the Bird Lady, that an old tome might exist in the Diendrin Abbey, which should be in this area. Once they arrive, they find out that none of the townsfolk seem to know about the Abbey's existence. But once they decide to check in at the local church, they find a young deaconess. She seems very cagey and uncooperative at the mention of the Abbey. Perhaps she knows a few things. Or perhaps she's always just a few steps away from getting her relationship with the unpopular local miller exposed. It's hard to tell. Turns out the town recently had a completely different owner and runner of the church. His name was Father Franz, and he recently died. This has left his adopted daughter Elsa, the deaconess, to take over. But it's not a simple matter of just taking over his position during sermons. In fact, Father Franz was an important religious figure in the area, mostly for non-religious things. See, the town of Terrio is a small farming village, similar to Pazlaw, especially in regards to worship. While there is a church in town, it's not a place frequented by the locals. They instead choose to follow a pagan god of the area, which makes the church's existence a bit of an enigma. Why was it built if there was not a religious following in the area? Why has there not been more pressure from church authorities at large to convert the locals away from their particular brand of paganism? The answer to all of these questions was Father Franz. He not only held sway in the church enough to keep them at bay, but was not so stuck in his own ways to deny the existence of pagan gods, despite, such things being anathema to the church's teachings. Even though Franz does not actually appear in the story on account of, being dead, he is one of the more important side characters who helps to integrate different parts of this narrative world. He's a father of the church, so he follows their teachings to an extent, but as Lawrence and Holo soon dig up, he also was the manager of the Diendrin Abbey. The Abbey was just the cellar to the Terrio Church, and the Abbey kept a whole heap of records related to many pagan gods of the surrounding regions. Father Franz's goal with his research was to find a kind of common ground, to find reconciliation between church dogma and the pagan beliefs of the locals. He seemed to believe that the pagan gods themselves were perhaps created by his own god, though he does not know the purpose of that. None of this research was shared, of course, probably for fear of persecution from the church itself. Can't have people believe that there are other powerful entities out there. Then the commoners might think that it's fine to not fear their own supreme powerful god, right? Lawrence and Holo eventually melt the cold exterior of the deaconess a bit, enough to gain access to the Abbey's library and begin looking up Holo's history in earnest, or at least the fate of Yotsu. They learn that in the years since Holo's departure, it has been either destroyed or abandoned. This happened after a bunch of local entities fought with something called the Moon Hunting Bear. What this means for any semblance of friends or family that Holo had, let alone her home, is unknown. Also unknown is the status of the bear, but it's enough to let the pair know what might be awaiting them further north. They could have left at this point. But this arc has its own problems. Due to its disconnected nature from our protagonists, to a point, I can sort of see why the anime skipped over this arc, but it's still a shame regardless. Elsa is a fine character, and also, Lawrence trying to befriend the locals is just, it's good reading. At the end of the day, though, our duo gets embroiled in the town's own politics. Specifically, they now have to deal with the pressure that Terrio receives from a nearby and much larger town. You see, Terrio had a bunch of trade benefits in their deals with said town. These benefits were negotiated by the former father. So, with his death, the larger town has come back and wants to renegotiate for crops. At least outwardly, that's what they want to do. Inwardly, they want to wipe the pagan village off the map. They attempt this by claiming they received poisoned wheat from them. So here's the merchant side of this plot. Terrio sold their wheat to this nearby town at a set price. Now, after some time has passed, that town's merchants claim that the wheat was poisoned. So, they want to return the entire crop, claiming no harm done, let's just reverse the transaction. But because it's been a while, and the town's crop is their livelihood, they already spent the money in prep for next year. They spent it repairing tools, fixing the town, buying new livestock. They don't have the money anymore to reverse the transaction. Hence the perception that the goal here is to actually and legally wipe Terrio off the map. Their accusers even show up with the local bishop to have everybody accused of heresy to boot. But our protagonists work to brush all of that off with some creative showmanship and some wolf god magic. Firstly, they showcase the miracle of the local pagan god by having said, "God, grow all of the wheat," instantly. They say that the pagan god is actually one of the church's god's creations, and therefore is good and just. The pagan god created this miracle, but that god themselves are just doing the work of the true god. That must be what happened, right? What else could have caused all of this? Basically, we showed you a miracle. Either explain it yourself or let's just sweep all of this under the rug and be friends, okay? So that shuts up the bishop. But there's also still the matter of the returned wheat. Technically, the merchants could still demand payment. Some of the wheat had been poisoned, and while it's a bit of an elephant in the room that the merchants poisoned it themselves to bring us to this point, they could still play innocent. You know, as long as they were willing to handle the angry mob of villagers who are being threatened with their livelihoods. Villagers who also just witnessed a miracle by their god. So the merchants back down. But Lawrence, in his infinite mercantile wisdom, decides to actually help those merchants out a bit. He does this by removing the particularly good terms for the villagers of Terrio. Sure, they're not happy about it, but Lawrence explains that if those terms are kept, then conflict will just keep occurring. He and Holo won't be here next time to help them fix things, so let's just placate everybody. But how does this help the village? Well, why not teach them to bake cookies with their wheat and use it as a new export? This sounds kind of contrived, because it is. Like, this arc just had to tie a massive bow around all of its issues and wrap everything up for some reason. Oh, we solved the problems by having everybody just make cookies now. What? Oh, no one around here knows how to make cookies. It's a recipe from the South. And now the villagers can make a killing off of selling cookies. It's a solution that works, but only does so because the narrative has been contorted so much just to make it so. But cookies it is. Elsa and her miller lover can now be happy. The pagan gods get to stay alongside the church. The villagers are no longer in financial straits, and they all have cookies. This is what we call a win-win. And our duo continues along their merry way. What is quite interesting at this point is actually where we are in the story of all of the mediums. In the original light novel, the Terrio arc consists of the entire 4th volume. Volume 4 out of 17, just over 20% of the way through. In the manga, the end of the Terrio arc lands us just after the start of Volume 8. 8 out of 16. So we are halfway through the manga. And while this arc wasn't adapted into the original anime, based on where we are, it should have taken place around the halfway point of season 2, so based on its position relative to the other arcs, we are 3/4 of the way through that. My point here is that ignoring the original, of course, every other adaptation likes to cut things massively. Granted, of course, this arc also doesn't fit with the flow of the anime's secondary narrative. Oh, what do I mean by that? I can finally talk about it, since now we have all of the context. The reason why I believe that the anime decided to extend the Amadi arc and completely cut the Terrio arc, despite Amadi getting less page time in the original comparatively, is because the anime's secondary narrative is all about the romance between our two characters and how it can better focus on the drama surrounding that. Think about it. All of the choices that are anime specific cater to this secondary narrative. In the initial arc, Chloe was added. Why? Not only does it give us additional eye candy, not that it really needed it after introducing a naked wolf girl, but it also adds another romantic interest for Lawrence into the mix where previously there wasn't one. Second arc, there's a constant tension between the pair because Lawrence is treating the shepherdess Nora quite well. While really he's only being polite, Holo still gets jealous. Arc 3 of the anime spends honestly far too much time on Amati. It does this because the story can further turn up the drama in their relationship with this wrench. Then Terrio gets cut because, there's nothing in this arc that can help or harm the romantic subplot. It's just not there. They can't just try and claim, Elsa is going to magically fall for Lawrence unless, you cut out the fact that she has a lover. But then again, after retconning Chloe into the story so that there is additional romantic tension there, it wouldn't have surprised me to have cut the Miller out to suit purpose. But I suppose it just made far more sense to make the Amati arc as long as it needed to be instead. And let me be clear, I have nothing against the romantic relationship between Holo and Lawrence. It is a big part of even the light novel. But the anime tries to take that and put so much more focus on it that I just felt didn't need it. We know that they are slowly growing closer together. We know that traveling together is making their relationship stronger. Heck, if you know about the sequel series' existence, you already know that they eventually have a kid, even if you don't know the circumstances behind it. But it's all these edits to the adaptations that just rub me the wrong way. Unlike the anime, the manga was actually completed. It's finished. But at this narrative point, it's already halfway through its run. And that's with cutting out the whole business with Amati. So where I got worried was with wondering what else is going to get cut. How worthwhile is any of the story at all in the grand scheme of things if it can be cut or edited however someone likes? And I do mean edited. Oh yes, let's talk about that. Let me readjust here, okay? Some say that time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong. Time is like an ocean in a storm. You may feel like you are going one way, following one singular path, only to realize that you are in a completely different place at a completely different time. That was not just a botched Prince of Persia reference. That is the experience of what it's like to read the manga after reading the light novel. The manga, beyond this point, does not follow the light novel to the letter. Why? At first, I thought that this was because it's the author's own way to maybe better organize things, to streamline their own narrative. Perhaps they thought that they got a bit long-winded or something while writing the novel. Or maybe, after seeing how the anime adaptation played out, they determined that some things needed to be cut. Could be. Or someone realized just how long this was taking. As it was, I mean, it took 10 years to make as much manga as they did make. Where we are now, after the Terrio arc, already took 5 years. This is all a lot of time for one artist to commit to, let alone doing more volumes of manga. So I suppose at least that is understandable. But the anime doesn't change anything. The anime plays this next arc straight, which purists might think is a good thing. But as someone who has watched it, someone who watched it when it originally aired back in 2009, I can tell you it was not a good thing. In general, if you want the full story of Spice and Wolf from a single medium, at least right now, the light novel is literally the only way to go. Perhaps the 2024 adaptation will change that in future, but considering the sheer amount of content that it would have to cover, I have my doubts. The original printing of the light novel is 17 volumes of pure text, remember. Now, not all of that is the mainline story. There are several volumes of side stories, the side color volumes that have secondary stories, but 14 volumes is the main story of Lawrence and Holo. Yes, I am ignoring the fact that the light novels started up again with the whole spring log stories in 2016, but hell, if you want to include those, then that's another 7 volumes of text! Any other medium will, by necessity, have to be longer to cover the same amount of content. But none of them are. The original anime adaptation, again, is only 2 seasons with 12 episodes each. And it only goes as far as Volume 5. Worse, Volume 4 of the light novel, covering the entire events of the town of Terrio that we just mentioned, is skipped over. So it's not even all of the first 5 volumes. And that's after 24 episodes of anime. The manga of the series is considered finished and complete, but even this adaptation cuts things out. The first most notable one that threw me for a loop is when the manga decided to skip over all of Volume 3 of the light novel, the courtship between Holo and Amati, as well as the appearance of Dian, which gives our protagonists the first glimpse at the fate of Yotsu. None of that is covered in the manga. At least not properly. The manga does, unlike the anime, cover Volume 4, the Terrio arc, which is odd. I would have thought that if adaptations had to decide what stories to cover and adapt, that they would all pick the same ones. Turns out, I was wrong about that. But it goes further when the manga decides to just completely jumble up the events of Volume 5 and beyond. By deciding to meet the young boy Cole before Eve is introduced. The manga glosses over the fur trade debacle, having it still happen, just now without Lawrence's involvement somehow, but that's what they do. If you haven't read the light novel, by the way, imagine that, like, halfway through the second season of the anime, there is now this young boy who acts like an apprentice to Lawrence. He's there now, and he's just part of this arc, even though the light novel doesn't introduce him until later. Like, good luck sorting that out in your brain. Oh, Holo needs to have some healing salve because she danced too hard? Really, manga? What kind of rave was she at? No. She needed that salve originally because she spent almost a full day in wolf form transporting Lawrence and Cole ahead of Eve so that they can cut her off following her backstabbing them. But since Eve hasn't been introduced yet, things are just a mess. Now, if you've never read the light novel and only went by either the anime or the manga, none of this really matters to you. You don't know what you're missing out on. You are blissfully unaware. But if you have read the original material, these things become a lot more jarring. This makes my upcoming attempts to explain the final arc of the anime and the whole debacle with Eve and the fur trade a bit difficult, because I now have 3 different versions of this story stuck in my head, and they're all just kind of living there at once, even though there's enough changes in all of them to distance it from the light novel. The anime included. Like, well, it didn't finish the arc, for one thing. So let's attempt to go over it as we wind down our retrospective here, shall we? Lawrence and Holo arrive in the town of Lenos. They are still on the path north and planning on gathering all of the info that they can about Yotsu and the surrounding area as they go. They want to speak to the town chronicler, as they did with Dion, but in Lenos, the chronicler doubles as the secretary for the Council of 50, a group of town heads that make up what is essentially the government. The canceling of the Northern Crusade has ripples even here. The fur trade industry has lost major deals that occur around this time of year for the town's craftsmen, because normally, during the Northern Campaign, the craftsmen of Lenos would use fur to make a bunch of finished products. Products that knights and mercenaries of the campaign would buy. However, since those customers aren't coming anymore, those same craftsmen need to find a profit elsewhere, which is difficult because the only people coming into town are foreign merchants. Merchants who would much rather just buy the raw fur than any finished product. Now, you could think, well, if the craftsmen can't afford to make products that won't sell, why would they care if they can't buy the fur that they aren't going to use? Well, I'd imagine that it's because the fur traders here would rather have a guarantee of sales every year. Because here's the problem. What if the campaign is canceled again? Fur traders don't want to worry about their furs not being sold because they're unneeded. So they might be convinced by foreign merchants to sell more than just the furs they have on hand. The merchants might also buy next year's furs in advance as well. This would leave the town's craftsmen high and dry if the crusade kicked back in the following year. Or even if it doesn't, this would outright remove furs from the market, which is kind of a big deal for anything a craftsman would want to make. So this has left the Council of 50 in a bit of a bind. They have two options. One, allow the foreign merchants to buy fur, which might decimate the town's profits in future. Or two, deny furs to be sold to anyone outside of the city. This means that local merchants will have furs available for crafting, but there is still no guarantee that what they make will sell, no guarantee that another canceled crusade won't come along, and it limits the profit of the fur traders who want their furs sold. It would drag the entire economy of the city down. Lawrence finds out about all of this slowly, from tidbits leaked accidentally from a nun who happens to reside with the chronicler. Also from some info he charms out of the local barmaid. But none of that immediately matters to Lawrence because there is no way for him to personally profit from it. Until an opportunity arises. While staying at a local inn, the pair gain the attention of one Eve Bolan. She is a female merchant who has taken to covering her face, pretending to be a man, and making her living selling statues to the local church. Eve comes to Lawrence with a proposal. She has heard that the council has already made their decision on what to do. She has heard that they plan to allow merchants to buy fur, but only with cold, hard cash. The idea is that most larger trade organizations and merchants rarely buy anything with cash, preferring to trade with either credit or other goods. Therefore, they would be unable to buy into the fur trade. This would massively limit but not stop the amount of furs being traded, leaving plenty for the craftsmen in town. Unless you get a savvy merchant who finds out about it beforehand and comes up with a plan to raise a whole bunch of money and then use that to buy out the entire fur market and smuggle it out of the city as soon as possible to sell for a massive profit elsewhere. And that's exactly what Eve proposes to do. She has made plenty of money with her dealings with the church, but they recently threw her out. She doesn't want revenge against them, per se, but since they threw her out after she proposed this very plan to them, she instead wants to be the one to make the profit before the church can. Kind of in spite, but also because she just really wants the money. So where do Lawrence and Holo come in? Well, more money is always good, and it just so happens that a daughter of a noble could fetch a high price. And what do you know? Holo just so happens to look so good that she might come from nobility. So they get a loan from a trading guild using Holo as collateral. They then want to use those funds to buy up all the fur, transport it downriver, and sell it for a massive fortune. Then they will repay the loan and get Holo back. Simple, right? It's a shame that Lawrence seems to have learned nothing from the gold smuggling incident. Specifically, that when large sums of money are involved, the chances of backstabbing become higher and higher. Eve knocks out Lawrence and takes off with the cash, though she's not so much of a dick to leave him with nothing. She did plan on leaving the city alongside the owner of the inn, so she just left the building's deed behind for Lawrence to use. It would be useless for buying furs that require cash to purchase, but it would be enough to trade for collateral on Holo. They just don't get anything else for their trouble. Lawrence retrieves Holo and they escape from town, presumably on a path to follow Eve and either gain revenge or just get some sort of profit back from the risks that they put in. So, what happens next? Well, if you watch the anime, nothing. This is the exact moment where the anime adaptation of Spice and Wolf ends. After 2 seasons, we only get halfway into dealing with Eve Bolan. We escape the town of Lenos that is currently on fire after the craftsmen revolt upon the announcement of the council's decision, and while the anime doesn't show it, we leave with Eve Bolan traveling downriver with a massive boat of furs with our duo close behind her, though they are still far enough away to come across a young boy named Cole downriver. When I first talked about this ending over a decade ago now, well, let me be honest, because I dug up the script for that video. I realize now how different my opinion on the series is compared to back then. I previously decried the heavy focus on economics. I explicitly state back then that I didn't give a shit about economics, which is hilarious because now, here we are, in this video a decade later, I've gone so far out of my way to hopefully explain all of the economics in this show. I did this because I now feel like they are so integral to the overall plot. That said, I also do agree with my past self that this final arc with Eve in the anime is lacking Holo compared to the other arcs. I feel like Lawrence spends way more time talking with other female characters here than Holo, so at least I know I had some of my priorities straight back in the day. I also pointed out that the ending of the anime left a bad taste in my mouth. One that back in 2011 when I made that video, and even in 2009 when I first watched the series, that I assumed could be fixed by the announcement of a season 3 that never came. Sure, we now, in 2023, have a new anime announcement, but who knows how far in the narrative that one plans to go. So, while I did and do recommend the second season of Spice and Wolf, the anime, I can't help but feel like I almost wanted it to not exist. I feel like while the first season didn't end in an ideal way, narratively, it still felt like it completed an arc, and it did so in a way that had this air of finality to it. The ending here in season 2 doesn't have that. There's still a bunch of stuff with Eve going on right now. So much that the light novel takes the next several volumes to cover it all. Looking back, I almost wish that they didn't adapt the fur trade arc at all, and instead just, went to Terrio. Because, if you weren't planning on ending it properly anyway, you might as well have just gone to the place where the audience could then feel like we wanted more at the end of it. I mean, we wanted more anyway, to be fair. It just took us years to get anything in a visual medium with, voice acting and music again. So I guess now we're talking about the VR game. I call this section the VR Gambit, kind of in jest. It's not like it's a real Gambit like some of the others we've talked about in the narrative previously, but it is interesting just how bandwagony it felt at the time, and, still feels now. In early 2019, the Hasakura-led company Spicy Tales started up a Kickstarter for a Spice and Wolf project. Keeping in mind the timeline, this is less than a month after the manga finished its run, and also about 3 years into the continuation of the mainline light novel. So it's not like the series is obscure or anything. This is not trying to keep the franchise alive, because it very much was alive. The Kickstarter raised over 30 million yen in total. The Kickstarter, though, wasn't for a new novel, it was for a game. I thought about putting game in quotations there, but that would be an argument for another time. It's not just any executable program that you click on with a personal computer, it's one that exists in virtual reality. Spicy Tales developed an add-on side story that takes place somewhere within the original light novel story. Here, Lawrence and Holo are taking shelter from the rain in an abandoned water mill. After Lawrence unceremoniously sits on the player's face, his perspective becomes ours, and the game plays out its narrative. They discuss things, they bicker, and in general, this is exactly the kind of thing that most people enjoyed Spice and Wolf for, just without all of the gripping elements of the main story, because the entire thing has to be presented to a character who is sitting still. It's not a bad spin-off. I mean, it even lets you showcase a Steam achievement saying that you got Holo to give you head pats. So that's pretty great. But I can't honestly say that the narrative here adds anything to the story, because it's not anything more than like filler for diehard fans. I say this as a diehard fan, but since that program was so successful, they made another one, and Mayuri is in this one. I hope you knew about Wolf and Parchment when the second VR title came out, because if you didn't, you might be wondering where the hell she came from. But again, this VR title is also for diehard fans, and I would write that off as the only noteworthy thing about either of these games if it wasn't for the little option on the main menu of Spice and Wolf VR 2. Anime? What the hell does this mean? Oh, that's cool. They have a slide projector and are showing off stills from the anime while explaining to their daughter how they first met. Oh, that's cute. But wait, if they're using the anime, then doesn't that mean Chloe? So this VR game, which takes place during the sequel light novel, acknowledges the additions and changes from the anime adaptation. It does this instead of the narrative presented in the original work. This was written by Hasakura? I can't say anymore that the narrative changes in the anime were done by the adaptation team alone. I can't say that they just changed things for the adaptation's benefit, because the author is doing the exact same thing. But I don't understand. Why is the writer going back and changing their own work? What kind of George Lucas nonsense is this, that Chloe is now made canon by the original author? And she's not just an anime-only edition? This kind of becomes the crux of any problem I have with Spice and Wolf. Because it's hard to feel like there's a definitive version of the story anymore. Sure, you can say the light novel is the definitive version like always and call it a day. It's not like anything happened to the books you already bought. I'm sure someone will tell me. But when the writer himself changes things in later official materials, it's hard not to wonder if he would have just, changed the light novel if given the chance. There's no bedrock of the definitive article, something I always prefer to exist. Like, I could sit here, and still might do in the future, talking about narrative differences between the anime adaptations of Full Metal Alchemist. Why some parts work better than others, in contrast to the much more common belief that Brotherhood is the definitive version. I don't believe it is, personally, but regardless of that argument, at the very least, we can all probably agree that the actual definitive version of Full Metal Alchemist is the original manga, right? Because of course it is. At no time has Arakawa come out and stated that, you know what? No, actually, the entire second half of the 2003 adaptation was really good. Even better than what I thought of. Because if she did think that, she would have wrote it that way. Because she finished the manga after the 2003 adaptation existed. Hasakura coming in here in a VR game, of all things, canonizing Chloe is just a strange turn of events. A turn that, in my mind, could be seen as decanoning the original light novel, because why would the author themselves conform to a version of events that is not their own? I mean, was Chloe actually sneakily written by Hasakura back in the day? Like, he doesn't have any writing credits for the anime, just the standard "this was based on the work of" credit that all adaptations should have. Maybe he did write her in. Not that that helps. So, do we not have, like, a definitive version of the story anymore? Am I blowing this out of proportion? Let me be fair. I'm sure there will be someone in the comments of this video, if there's not already, telling me to chill. Because again, the light novel still exists, and just because I feel like the author is going back and changing things, it's not like they've re-released the novel with an altered story that suddenly includes Chloe. Yeah, that didn't happen. I made that more dramatic than it needed to be in an attempt to justify my emotions at this revelation. The main reason I like having a clear example of a definitive version of a work for, well, anything, is because I never want to have to go through 5 different versions of one thing and then piece it all together in my head to get the full picture of something. I hate, for example, that Atlas recently released a remake of Persona 3, but without adding a bunch of the additional content from the FES PS2 re-release, or even any additional content from the portable PSP version of the game, because both of those were different than the original PS2 release. Play this brand new remaster / remake of a classic game, they say. But if you want the whole story, guess what? You still have to go back to this old-ass PS2 game to find the answer. There has been no definitive version of Persona 3. Doesn't exist. Unlike Personas 4 and 5 that have Golden and Royal respectively, and this sort of thing just pisses me off to no end. The only real response someone could have to something like this is just to, well, ignore what you don't like. But I find that to just be the lazy and perhaps somewhat defeatist way of looking at it. The flip side is to just become a real fan and experience literally everything, you scrub, which I no longer have time for. My list of games unplayed, manga unread, and anime unwatched could fill the solar system. So for the pieces of media I do experience, I don't want to have to bend over backwards for it. Like, I've always been the guy who ended up buying physical guides to PlayStation RPGs back in the day. Not because I didn't think I couldn't beat the game on my own, but because I rightly know that I would never 100% any of those games without said guides. I know this because I didn't 100% them even with the guides, since Final Fantasy X-2 tracks whether or not you make Yuna go to sleep in her bed at the start of every major chapter of the game for some reason. And if you didn't do that, too bad, you don't get the super secret ending of the game, you idiot. Of course, bringing it back to Spice and Wolf, there is still a slim chance that everything could work out. I would not be lying if I said that one of the reasons why I sat down to write this video was because of the upcoming remake adaptation of the series. At this point, we know very little about what it is, but it looks to be a fresh start from the top of the narrative with 15 years better animation behind it. It's even keeping a decent chunk of the old anime's creative staff. While the series is once again jumping studios, Takahashi is still in the director's chair. Well, more specifically, he's now in the chief director's chair, with Hijiri Sanpei currently being credited as the show's director. I don't really have time to get into the differences between the positions of chief director and director, or why there is a distinction between the two in the first place, mostly because I don't even clearly know, so I don't feel qualified to explain. And I also have the suspicion that the real explanation would probably be different depending on which production that distinction is happening on. But big swaths of the original anime creative team are coming back for this one, and the existing trailer that I have access to showcases that at the very least the first arc is being done over again. So this is not trying to be a season 3. The main worry I have about this adaptation is, well, Spice and Wolf is long. I mean, seriously, look at this video. Look at how long this video is of me recapping just what the original anime covered. Well, yes, plus the Terrio arc. And then realize that this wasn't even half of the story of the light novel. Say nothing of Wolf and Parchment. But because it's so long, I have zero confidence in the new adaptation being able to cover it all. At best, we might have it cover all of the content that the manga did, because 19 manga volumes would be so much easier to make into an anime than 24 volumes of printed text that the light novel currently has. But knowing what I know about anime production, I feel like I can take an accurate guess as to what might happen with this series. I'm about to date this video so hard when it finally comes out and I'm wrong, but I feel like the new anime is going to do a lot of skipping. If we are lucky, we might see a readaptation of the initial arc to provide context, but then skip right ahead to maybe about where the last anime left off and continue from there, possibly following the manga. Or what it could do is pull a Kino's Journey, because Kino's Journey is another anime favorite of mine that had a readaptation in 2017. But it wasn't a one-to-one remake of its old anime, nor a one-to-one adaptation of its original novel. Instead, what that one became was just a greatest hits of the fan favorite arcs from the novel. That could be what happens here. Just going through the narrative and adapting what it wants and glossing over what it doesn't. Heck, when the manga got to the Terrio arc, it just added in our protagonists meeting the bird lady Dion. It's kind of an important meeting in the narrative because it's the first time where Holo meets another being like herself, but the manga just skips that because it's not covering the arc anymore. That's the kind of thing that I see happening with the new adaptation. There's just too much stuff to cover, and I doubt the production has the budget or backing to cover it all. Especially when they didn't have that the last time either. So why would this time be any different? When I first started writing this, I had to jot down like all of the points that I roughly wanted to make in the video, all of the things I wanted to cover, and I know that when I did a similar thing for Death Note earlier this year, I went all the way to the end of the narrative. Luckily, I did that because the anime did that, so I had footage to pull from, and I didn't have to rely 100% on my face reading from a teleprompter for large swaths of the video more than I needed to. But here, so much of my own journey with Spice and Wolf ended with that second season. Yeah, I did eventually go back and read the original light novel multiple times even, and I highly recommend you to do that. Just don't get the collector's edition. It's way too unwieldy for an actual read-through of the novel. But as I stated elsewhere, I prefer watching anime for a reason over original material. It's the combination of visuals, acting, and music that reading a manga or a book just doesn't have, and I much prefer it. So a lot of the enjoyment, a lot of the magic for me in experiencing this story comes from the combination of all of these elements. Things like the VR game are nice, but never really scratched the same itch that I wanted. The small amount of banter between the characters is wonderful, but Spice and Wolf, to me, has always been about more than that. Yes, the banter is a very large part of it, but the banter within the context of the narrative is what I like. It's the combination of having Holo and Lawrence bicker at one another while there are actual narrative stakes that make the story the most interesting for me. What I actually thought might be helpful for a time was going to the audiobook for the light novel, because I can happily say that that's a thing. Yen Press recently started releasing Japanese light novels into audiobooks, usually with an actor related to the franchise doing the narration. In the case of Spice and Wolf, the first few volumes were narrated by J. Michael Tatum. But what excited me even more when I looked into it was that from volume 3 onwards, Tatum would share narration credit with Barina Palencia, the English voice for Holo. What I assumed this to mean was that the two would be trading off chapters back and forth, which was correct, but I also naively assumed that even if one of them was narrating a particular chapter, the other would still at least provide the voice of their respective character, which, at least for volume 3 when I listened to it, turned out not to be the case. And I mean, like, the banter between these characters is so good, and you're already paying the two actors to work on this project. Why are they not always voicing their characters where appropriate? Is there some technicality that makes it impossible to do that because it's an audiobook and not a full cast production as Audible sometimes showcases these things as? It just feels like a waste. That would have been so great to listen to. I mean, Tatum does do a great Holo, and Palencia likewise does a good Lawrence. But when they're both right there, it's frustrating. I love Spice and Wolf. I'm not going to be defeatist and say that I loved Spice and Wolf in past tense. Like, oh, so many things changed and my love has gone. No, I still love it. But as I have hopefully been able to showcase, how it's been adapted and changed over time has brought about these frustrations that I wanted to attempt to express. I didn't want to let them boil under the surface while hoping for a freaking miracle that the new adaptation is perfect in every way, which is just absolutely impossible and a completely unrealistic expectation. So what I'm going to do now instead is do what the Spice and Wolf anime did. I'm gonna leave the retrospective here, even though there's more narrative to talk about. Will the new Spice and Wolf be the change I want to see in the world? Well, third time's the charm. Hopefully. Hey there, Ark here, just finishing up the edit of this video, which surprisingly did not take as long to edit and work on as the Death Note video, despite, this one being so much longer. But end-of-year deadlines will do that to you, I suppose, even if the deadline was self-inflicted. A good lot of this video was kind of like a therapy thing for me going into it. I just have so much love for this series, but also so much apprehension about things related to it that I wanted to attempt to vocalize that somehow in this video. Not entirely sure if that came off properly because, hey, I have been staring at this video in one shape or form for the last few months now, so I don't feel like I can be objective on it anymore. But I can still hope that it worked out. I can also hope that you guys enjoyed this journey of mine through the narrative of Spice and Wolf and its various adaptations. So here at the end of the video, I wanted to give special thanks, of course, to my patrons, whose names have been scrolling for a bit, but a super special thank you to patrons Omar Showman, Ross Emerson, Hector Montemayor, Sir Yamako, Raifan Bonaparte, and Sailor Arashi. Thank you for supporting me throughout this year and many years before, and hopefully in the future. I hope to do a lot more videos of this nature, but hopefully not in the same amount of time constraints. If you like this sort of video and you want to see more of this type, either about popular anime franchises or perhaps some lesser known ones, let me know down in the comments. I'm planning out my upcoming video schedule for the next year, and those things are helpful. And with that, I'm gonna go wrap presents for Christmas and pray that this video exports and uploads alright. So until next time, watch more anime and stay frosty.